Thank you for joining us for this edition of Capitol Week with David Owen, which wraps up the main run of the 96th legislative session. I'm Dirk Lammers of Cetera Services, joined once again by David Owen, president of the South Dakota Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Welcome, David. It looks like you're in a part of the Capitol we seldom see.
I'm either in real trouble now or I've just wandered someplace, you're right, that virtually nobody gets to see. Behind me is the chambers for the South Dakota Supreme Court. We have 5 justices on the Supreme Court, and you can see the 5 chairs there. The podium in front is where attorneys stand to present their arguments. We are one of the few states whose Supreme Court meets in their original chambers. These were built for the Supreme Court, and we've not moved them anyplace else, which a lot of states have. You will notice the painting in the background. That's another one by Charles Holloway. It's called Mercy of the Law, and it depicts an angel watching over the legal process. But the room was renovated, as was the Capitol, in 1978. So they restored the wood, brought in the brass fixtures that were there originally. And while it's no longer open to the public, except when the court's in session, it is an elegant room that does very important work.
Let's get to the session. One of the biggest topics of this session was cannabis, with a bevy of bills spurred by voters passing both medical marijuana and recreational marijuana at the ballot box this past November. Let's take a look at which bills passed and which bills failed.
Well, first of all, the whole issue of recreational marijuana was sent off to the courts. A circuit court has ruled that that amendment, Amendment A, was unconstitutional because it had more than one subject, was more of a revision, and directly had the Department of Revenue writing rules instead of making reference to the executive branch. That leaves medical marijuana. I will remind viewers, medical marijuana passed with 70% of the vote, not a slim margin. It was only defeated in 3 counties. And what we learned during the session is the people were watching this very closely. There was 11 bills introduced on the whole marijuana topic, and only 3 of those managed to pass, which means, basic math, 11 of them failed. The 3 that passed, the most significant one was House Bill 1100. This was the governor's attempt to move the effective date for medical marijuana from July 1, 2021 over to July 1, 2022. In the House of Representatives, they shortened that to 6 months so that it would take effect in January of 2022, just to give the Department of Revenue time to write all the rules and decide who gets cards, how those cards will be distributed, who can sell marijuana. It's a complicated process that honestly, most states have taken a year and a half to kind of establish. Well, when that bill went over to the Senate put significant amendments in it. Most significantly, as they said, they would decriminalize possession of 1 ounce or less of marijuana. Well, that was going the opposite direction that people thought, but the Senate agreed. So it goes back over to the House. The House doesn't agree with those and appoints what's known as a conference committee. 3 from the House, 3 from the Senate. They go to a room to try to work out a version of the bill. They can't. They send a report back to their respective bodies that says there's nothing to adopt. At that point, each body can reappoint another conference committee. If at first you don't succeed, the decision was made by both bodies to not accept the report and not appoint another committee. So House Bill 1100's dead, and the governor gets no delay in the time it takes to write the rules for medical cannabis. So we will watch medical marijuana between now and July 1st. The other 2 bills that passed were House Bill 1061, which we've been giggling about a little bit through the session. That says it's illegal to smoke marijuana while you're in a vehicle or use other products. This wasn't necessary before because marijuana wasn't legal, but if marijuana is going to be legal. We probably ought to tell people not to use it while they're driving. Senate Bill 35 is interesting because it will allow banks to have banking relationships with people in the marijuana business. Marijuana is still illegal with federal law, so it kind of complicates banking when you're dealing with a product that's not legal. So this says in South Dakota, you can provide these banking services, which should save us from the experience Colorado had, where all of those marijuana places were just chock full of cash. And this will make those transactions more secure and the whole industry safer.
Another topic that has put South Dakota in the spotlight, and not necessarily positive, was HB 1217. This was described by supporters as promoting continued fairness in women's sports, but it was derided by opponents as an anti-transgender bill. What happened here, David?
House Bill 1217 is contentious because of how it was passed, or at least the rhetoric that was used to get it passed, and a serious, more nuanced conversation about the hormonal differences between males and females that can still be in effect as people that identify with a gender that they weren't born with and are going through transition. In this case, particularly males that are transitioning to be female. Proponents have a point. Testosterone levels and muscle mass give most men, most boys, a competitive advantage over women in the same sports. As they point out, in basketball, the women use a smaller ball. In hurdles, they have lower kind of hurdles. What gets difficult here is that having identified testosterone as the equivalent of a performance enhancing drug, the bill then does nothing to pursue the solution based on that analysis. The solution of the bill is to force everybody to talk about what their birth certificate says based on visual observation at the time of the birth about whether you're a boy or a girl. It forces every student to fill out a form that says they're a boy or they're a girl. And then it just passes a flat ban on males participating on female teams. Gone is the notion that we might look on a case by case basis, which is what we do in South Dakota now, to see if the individual has a performance enhancing advantage because of testosterone. Under current law, the High School Association deals with the district and the superintendent on a case by case basis. We've been doing this since 2013. We have had a handful of cases that have all been dealt with without any complaints that are driving this bill. The rhetoric I mentioned that successfully attracted enough votes on 1217 to get it passed, in spite of it dying in the Senate State Affairs Committee, the rhetoric suggests that you're not going to have women's sports, that so many boys, mediocre athletes to be sure, are going to sign up for the girls' teams, that they're going to take all the records, win all the games, take all the championships, and girls simply aren't going to have a chance. That has never happened. It isn't happening today. We have no transgender students trying to compete today, even under the rules we have. And it isn't going to happen in the future. People who identify as transgender that want to compete don't get to put on the girls' uniform just for the game and then go back to the boys' side for math class. The fact of the matter is, people that identify in a transgender way are changing their entire lives. They're living as the gender they identify with all day, all season, on the weekends, at home. And so this rhetoric that we're saving girls' sports is a fiction. But it was well researched enough and it was well played enough that it passed both houses of the legislature and sits on the governor's desk as this podcast is being done.
We had 3 bills on sports betting, and just one of that trio made it to the finish line. Please parse these first, David.
First, a little background. Las Vegas had a complete monopoly over sports betting for a long time, and then the U.S. Supreme Court said, you're bust. You lose. There's no rational reason for Las Vegas to be the only place that can bet on sports. That opens it up to all 50 states. In South Dakota, gambling is controlled by the Constitution. Last November, voters said, hey, we'd like to do that in South Dakota as well. The language that's used for gambling in South Dakota specifically references inside the city limits of Deadwood and inside a casino. Here's a caveat to be mindful of. Federal law gives tribal governments and reservations the right to have access to gambling the same as is available to other state governments. And so when we talk about changing sports betting, even though Senate Bill 44, which was the governor's bill, is the only one that succeeded, you will see sports betting actually in a casino on the reservations under tribal government control. But for the rest of us, at least initially, if we're going to bet on the Super Bowl, we're going to Deadwood and we got to walk into a casino. One of the other visions that did not pass but will be present in future legislative sessions would extend that ability to restaurants and bars with a full liquor license, but the betting line, the money flow, will go through those casinos in Deadwood. This is what they do in New Jersey with Atlantic City. So it was necessary that we adopt some kind of law to talk about how we bet on sports teams. And the answer in my history is poorly. We're going to have to do it in Deadwood, actually in a casino, which is probably going to mean I'm not betting at all.
Yeah, and I guess Wild Bill Hickok didn't exactly lose his life betting on the New York Jets, if I recall my history correctly.
But if he could have, he probably would have.
Exactly. HB 1046, which was passed by both chambers and signed by Governor Noem, limits liability for certain exposures to COVID-19. Please explain some of the details of this and how it might affect businesses.
This was a bill put together by a coalition of business groups that had about 4 members. It was widespread in the business community. What this simply says is if you're going to sue a business because you got COVID or you think in their business or it was a place of work, you're going to have to prove that there was some intent, some knowledge. This is going to have to be a negligent action with some level of intent. A couple of my board members asked me an interesting question. This takes effect in July. What are we going to do if we get sued next month? The language of the bill extends this protection retroactively to January of this year, 2021. So the chances of a lawsuit filed next month being resolved before July 1st are virtually non-existent. So it's a 2-year period of coverage that just more specifically says what has to be part of that lawsuit if we're going to litigate COVID cases.
Speaking of COVID, federal pandemic relief efforts brought in a ton of one-time money, and the legislators on the Appropriations Committee had to decide how it would be spent. So, David, show me the money.
You talk to legislators and you say, which is worse, not having any money and facing 10% budget cuts, which we've done before, or having $250, maybe $300 million to hand out to try to make everybody happy. Most of them will tell you that you can be more consistent by cutting budgets, making everybody miserable, than trying to figure out how to hand out money to make some of the people kind of happy. You can see on the screen a chart of where the major parts of this money went, but the big chunk is $75 million going to expand broadband to places in South Dakota that don't have it, and they don't have it because it's really expensive to get it out there. I've often joked that the last house to get broadband is going to cost 20 million by itself. But 75 million combined with 25 million of CARES money, other federal money, puts $100 million towards that goal. $50 million for scholarships to match money but made available by First Premier Bank and Bank Card. They're putting up 100 million. The state's going to put up 50, and they're going to raise 50 more. $200 million to underwrite for as long as you can see a series of needs-based scholarships in South Dakota. Then you'll notice $20 million for a bioproduct research facility in Brookings, $20 million to fix the railroad that goes from Pierre to Rapid City. I've watched this discussion for a long time. They actually drive that train 10 miles an hour for 100 miles or so, and a crew change. Having that railroad line be viable will do great things for the state. $9 million for maintenance, and the last one I will highlight is kind of a giggle. $4 million to implement the marijuana laws that now have to be done by July.
The legislature wanted to tackle the ongoing issue of workforce housing, but this effort fell short, didn't it? So what happened here?
I'm glad you brought that up. A number of things happened. A lot of cities are having trouble with affordable housing. We need workers. But as I've pointed out a number of times, we've noticed those workers like to live indoors. And so finding apartments or houses, starting houses in many communities is kind of a trick. And that's driven by some market forces and driven by regulations. So this story starts out as a $5 million bill to be split between Rapid City and Sioux Falls, to be used as a revolving loan fund in Rapid City and to be used by experienced housing development people in Sioux Falls. Then the smaller communities thought, well, we need a portion of this. We have serious issues. And so 5 million turned into 60 million, with $40 million available for towns with populations less than 100,000, and then 10 million for Sioux Falls and 10 million for Rapid City. Well, a stone that goes from $5 million dead weight to $60 million dead weight sinks pretty fast. So the fact that they had overestimated how much revenue would be available by about 50 million makes a $60 million bill the answer. But the other thing is, this is really complicated. And by the way, while we're having this discussion, the prevailing thought is that next year there will be more money, given the law that just passed with President Biden having signed 1.8 something trillion dollars moving across the land like a green tsunami. So next session, we may have a chance to revisit this complicated issue about housing, which will give, quite honestly, some of those smaller communities a chance to decide exactly what they're going to do with the money, because there weren't a lot of those answers this time. So look into the future. The issue remains. It's really complicated, but we have time to keep working on it.
We had a Senate Joint Resolution, SJR 5003, changes the required vote margin for certain initiated or legislature proposed constitutional amendments or initiated referendums. Now, this was seeking to change it to a 3/5 vote as opposed to a simple majority. How did this proceed through the legislature? And there were some weird things that went on with this, weren't there?
Why does everything this session start out with the line that says, okay, this is a little complicated? A number of things to talk about, Dirk. One of them is what this does as substance. The other thing is when we're going to get a chance to vote on it, because the proponents did something that I think is best described as sneaky. And there is an intent being placed on this bill that proponents don't generally admit to, that I want to share with our viewers. First of all, let's talk about what this thing does. Currently, if you propose a tax increase through a ballot measure, it takes 50% of the voters plus one person. This would say if you're going to have a tax or fee increase, it's going to take 3/5, which happens to be 60%. To be fair, years ago, we decided that if we're going to have tax and fee increases at the legislature, that ought to take 2/3, which is actually 66%. But that's the legislature. That's a deliberative body. That's different than how you speak to the masses. So moving tax increases to 60% is a significant jump. And then they're doing something else. They're saying, well, any proposal that spends $10 million a year or more in any of the first 5 years also takes 60%. And so that's going to be on the ballot. Now we get to kind of the sneaky part. There's 2 elections that are going to be held next year, the primary in June, general election in November. When this bill was first drafted, it was set for the June primary. We'll talk about why in a minute. As it left the House, it was amended to the general election because the House or the legislative joint rules say when the legislature places something on the ballot, it will be in the next general election. That's in a publication known as the Red Book, and it's the rules that govern the legislature. So it goes back to the general election. It goes, passes the House that way, goes through the Senate committee that way, and gets down to the Senate floor, where lo and behold, there's a motion to suspend that rule, which takes a 2/3 vote in the Senate, or 24 votes. And by gosh, they suspended the rules, and they moved it back to the June primary. There's 2 issues with House Joint Resolution 5003 that I can see. The first one is, back to Amendment A, this has 2 distinct topics in it, and we didn't discuss that during the legislature, so we have next year's session to kind of sort that out, that they are increasing the percent for both tax increases and spending. Let's see how the Amendment A lawsuit turns out to see if that's 2 topics. Even more serious, and what I refer to as the sneaky part of this, is they want to vote on this in June. Ballot measures take effect in July. So we're used to that being a fairly protracted period of time because they usually pass in November. So you got to wait until July for it to take effect. Next year, with this on the June primary, it takes effect 3 weeks later in July. On the November ballot, there may be a ballot measure that increases Medicaid expansion, making more people eligible for Medicaid services. This has passed by referendum in a number of states. So there is a portion of the people that have promoted this that are being accused of putting this in June, so it takes effect in July and drives that Medicaid vote from 50% to 60%, which is going to make it very difficult. So once again, the cynic in me, which has not a majority yet, but growing quickly, suggests that we're changing the rules of the game to make more certain the results that we want.
Wow, very complex. So 2020 saw competing bills on Juneteenth, one wanting to recognize it as a working holiday and the other looking to recognize it as a non-working holiday. What happened here?
This is a fascinating lesson about what happens in the legislative process. So I assume out of our viewers, I'm talking to 2 or 3 that are interested in this. Senate Bill 71 would have made Juneteenth. And as a quick reminder, that's a day in June when the Union Army got to Texas and informed the slaves that they had been freed with the Emancipation Proclamation. So this is a way to celebrate the end of slavery being notified in Texas. Senate Bill 71 made it a working holiday, a way to recognize, put it on the calendar. It doesn't require the state to recognize or do a paid holiday. Senate Bill 89 would have made it a full state holiday, which may or may not have been paid for state employees, most likely kind of would have. The business community actually, embracing diversity, supported Senate Bill 71, said this is important. We need to do this in South Dakota. The proponents, by which I mean the Democratic caucus primarily, decided that they were going to play a version of what's known as all or nothing. So they wanted Senate Bill 89 to pass. So they voted against 71, and they didn't get enough votes to pass 89. We're not going to celebrate Juneteenth until maybe next session, because what I think of was a misguided strategy. I understand their point. Give them credit for taking the gamble. Would note, as I did with the gambling, it didn't work.
SB 123, which was signed into law, requires a comment period for Attorney General statements regarding initiated measures and initiated amendments similar to the ones we've been talking about here. What changes does this piece of legislation make to the process, David?
Well, first, let me brag a little bit. This was a bill that was drafted by the South Dakota Chamber, put into play, given our experience of helping lead ballot measures in each of the last 9 elections. When ballot measures are going through the process, the Attorney General is given the task by statute of writing the official explanation. That official explanation is printed on every ballot that you get. It may be the only information some voters see. Currently, the Attorney General has 60 days to write that explanation, and once they release it, that's it. There's no opportunity for the public to comment. So we wanted to create a 10-day period where at least the contentious parties or folks that are geeky enough to follow ballot measures, I know a couple, might look at the measures and offer suggestions to the Attorney General's office. Didn't require them to respond. But what happened is the Attorney General asked for 20 days to make those comments. They got added on to the 60. So now that process goes from 60 to 80 days. I'd like to see that changed in the future, but more important, we've secured the right of people to be able to make comments on one of the most important communications for ballot measures. I'm proud of this result, and I think you'll see it. We moved the effective date to November, so it doesn't in play for this election, but starting in 2024, we'll have a chance to provide some ideas, at least, to that all-important statement that goes on every ballot.
We want to thank each of you for joining us each week for Capitol Week with David Owen. It's been fun. We've tried to educate you on some of the locales of the Capitol. We've talked about some bills, and we've made a few jokes along the way that we hope at least some of them drew a few laughs. David, any closing remarks for the viewing audience?
No, I want to thank Dirk from Cetra, and I'm going to have him put his company logo up on the full screen as we go through an exit comment. I am one that happens to respect and adore this process. It is an important process. It's an easy process to make fun of because there's a lot of goofy stuff that kind of happens. But these are 105 legislators who put down their private lives. And by the way, it's not just for 39 days of a legislative session. They get stopped in the store. They get calls at home. Their family gets yelled at. They make quite a sacrifice to come to peer, serve on committees, and make very important decisions about the future of South Dakota. So say thanks to a legislator, agree or disagree, thank them for their service, and understand this is a great process, and it's been a privilege to be part of it. Dirk, thank you for making this podcast watchable and as close to interesting as this chamber exec is likely to ever get.
Well, thanks, David. You've made it a lot of fun. We do have a veto day coming up, though. Any predictions on that?
The hottest bill sitting on her desk is that bill about female sports, House Bill 1217. The governor indicated early she was looking forward to signing it, but I know that there's been a high pressure campaign to get her to maybe veto it so it can be rewritten and something done. But it's always interesting to see. I always describe veto day as a collection of the afflicted, people whose bills have been vetoed, and the addicted, those of us that just can't turn their back on the process. We'll be there.
Great. Thanks again to everyone for joining us. Please give us a like and share below to carry us all the way into the 2022 session. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Derek.